Well, a national fundraising campaign has been launched tonight to help Ukraine. The Disasters Emergency Committee is appealing for funds to help people affected by the conflict. We're joined now to discuss that with David Miliband, the President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, and Jan Egeland, General Secretary of the Norwegian Refugee Council. Very good to talk to you both, gentlemen. And I'd like you both, first of all, we need to pause, don't we, and reflect on the speed and scale of what's going on here. David Miliband, 1 million people in a week.
Yes, the scale of this is obviously huge. It's on a par with the Syria crisis of 10 years ago, 6.5 million refugees in the end from Syria. But by the standards of the Syria crisis, it took 3 months for 1 million Syrians to flee from their own country. It's taken just a week to hit that number. And of course, what's going on inside Ukraine is even more challenging than the situation once you cross the borders, because you've shown throughout the day the pictures of the bombed out buildings. There are civilians there, and there are obviously at least 1 million, probably more civilians on the run inside Ukraine, trying to head for the kind of safety that you've just showcased from Lviv. So this really is a capstone for the modern age of impunity. It shows what happens when the rule of law becomes optional and when the rights of civilians are disregarded by an invading power.
Jan Egeland, I see you nodding along there in agreement, of course. And just on those numbers, 1 million people equates to something like 2% of the entire population of Ukraine in 8 days.
Indeed, it is explosive. I was myself in Ukraine last month, February, traveled up and down what was then the front line in eastern Ukraine. Let's remember there are millions who cannot also escape. In the eastern part of the country where my organization has been most active, there is a lot of elderly people, pensioners, retired miners, their widows. They cannot flee. They are disabled, etc. So what we're calling for is a truce, a humanitarian pause, so that we can resume humanitarian operations, so that the civilian population can get out of harm's way. It will be the only sensible thing, and I understand it was discussed today between the envoys of Ukraine and Russia.
Well, let's discuss that more then. David Miliband, I mean, there's a very big difference, as you both know better than most, between discussing safe corridors and actually getting them to work, implementing them. They were, of course, tried many times in Syria to, let's say, not great effect.
Well, I think that we do have a lot of experience of the denial of humanitarian aid, as well as the bombardment of civilians. And I'm afraid that the Syria example is one example, but Jan Egeland, as well as you, Dermot, will know well the lesson of the 1990s in the former Yugoslavia in Europe, where siege tactics were used extensively, where indiscriminate bombing was used extensively, and where the international system was massively challenged. Now, I've just been on the Zoom call with our team in Poland across the border from Ukraine. We are already identifying partner organizations, both in Poland and inside Ukraine. There's going to be great strain on the health system and on pharmaceutical supplies, as well as on the food and water infrastructure. And one lesson that we do know from the 90s and from the Syria campaign is establishing those routes for aid early is absolutely key. Of course, that doesn't absolve the politicians or the politics, and the politics can get in the way, as it is today in other countries around the world, like Yemen or Ethiopia, where aid is being denied. But I think there are some practical steps that are being taken by the NGOs who are part of this Disasters Emergency Committee campaign, as well as by the UN institutions. And that's absolutely vital if we're to avoid, or help some people avoid, the worst of this. Because Jan is right, there will be lots of people who can't get out, and some people who are injured or even killed on the way out. And we've got to be concerned about the situation inside Ukraine, as well as the European response across the border.
And Jan Egeland, what about the humanitarian colleagues you have on the ground in great numbers? Given the nature of the Russian attack, they're in great danger as well.
They are, and that's why we're calling for this truce today, this pause. directly to the Kremlin, directly to the parties. I have 70 colleagues in the Norwegian Refugee Council on the ground inside of Ukraine. But at the moment, they are fleeing for their life. They are spending most of the time in the bomb shelter. We have 40 colleagues in Severodonetsk, which is in the east. There is too little attention to the east. Most journalists are, like your good colleagues, in the western Ukraine. The casualties are mostly in the east. It's horrific, the fighting there. And there is also where the elderly, the pensioners, the most disabled are. So really, we need an end to this madness. We need an end to the assault on civilian cities. We need pauses. We need these humanitarian corridors. And we need to do, like David just mentioned, we need then, as we all are, setting up operations in neighboring countries and doing cross-border relief into Ukraine. Most of those in need are still in Ukraine. Very few, 1 million, has left. Another 10, 20 million are in harm's way.
Well, can I ask you a bit more, though, about that, the million that have left and presumably the many hundreds of thousands, and let's hope it's not too many more that follow, and the reception they get, David Miliband. Of course, the neighbouring countries, mainly EU countries, are dealing with the brunt of those numbers. And just tell me your view on the reception that they're getting there. The EU announcing that they're going to have Ukrainians will receive residence permits, access to housing, healthcare, education, and very important when it comes to being a refugee, the right to enter the labour market. Do you think that all European countries should offer this kind of reception?
Yes, I do. I think that the information that we have is that Europe is stepping up day by day, and it's stepping up better and better. Remember, there probably will be millions more. I think that the UN has estimated up to 5 million refugees, but the European continent is 500 million people. So let's bear that in mind as we think about the logistical and integration challenge. From my point of view, it's essential that every EU country, European Union country, all 27 of them, do offer the same rights, and they've committed to do that in the way that you've described. However, it's also very important that other European countries, I'm thinking of the UK, I'm thinking of Norway, I'm thinking of Switzerland, I'm absolutely clear that those European countries need to step up in the same way. And it's a source of enormous sadness to me that the UK has not yet joined that European mainstream in committing that Ukrainians, whatever their ties to the country, they will be able to find safe haven and they will be able to support themselves through work. Remember, this is an educated population that are coming out, and that they will be able to find services for their families. I think it's very, very important that Europe shows not just that it's able to defend itself, but that also it's able to defend its values. And that's vital in this conflict.
OK, I've got a last question for you both, because I can't have people with your experience on without exploring this issue. And it is, of course, the best way to end the suffering is to end the violence, is to end the war. And you're both deeply involved in diplomacy, in other lives, in other careers. And Jan Egeland, I mean, of course, you were deeply involved in so many peace processes, of course, some notably the Oslo Accords, the historic agreement between Israel and the PLO. I mean, do you see anything like that, any way of de-escalating this fairly soon?
It has to be very clear that this can end tomorrow. I mean, President Putin can end it tomorrow. This is not Syria with hundreds of armed groups, or the Congo with half a thousand armed groups. It's two armies. It's an attacking army. The Russian army can end it. And there has to be another big effort by diplomats to get the leaders, the Russians, to their senses. Then, of course, we also have to recognize that it didn't get better in Afghanistan or in Syria or in Yemen because it got worse in Ukraine. We also have to be as equally generous to the people fleeing from there as we are now to Ukraine. There is an enormous outpouring of sympathy and solidarity with Ukraine. We welcome that. Let's also remember all of the other refugees fleeing from elsewhere.
And David Miliband, your thoughts on the diplomacy, of course, with your experience as Foreign Secretary, meeting Putin, meeting Lavrov, seeing them up close and personal, negotiating with them. I mean, looking at their mindset now, is there any way of deflecting them from further extreme violence?
Dermot, I don't want to mislead you or your viewers. President Putin spoke to President Macron of France today, and the French readout was that they fear the worst. And frankly, I fear the worst now as well. I fear a pulverisation campaign on the cities of Ukraine. I fear for the civilians of Ukraine, whether they be in their bomb shelters or whether they be on the run. And this is now on a very, very dangerous course. There is only one side that can end this, and that is the Russian side. But I think it would be giving false hope to your viewers to pretend that there's any sign of that at the moment. What we do know is that there is unprecedented pressure on the Russian system as a result of the economic sanctions and other economic interventions that have taken place. And there is unprecedented protest inside Russia as well, incredibly brave people. But that's where the change is going to have to come. And it would be wrong to pretend that there's a diplomatic fix to get out of that.
Well, gentlemen, thank you both so much for sharing your expertise with us. David Miliband, Jan Egeland, very good talking to you. Thank you.